Couple of things for us to think about in terms of processing. One is that um, almost everything we eat is processed to some degree or another, right? If we make flour or we make bread out of flour, the wheat has been processed. So processing in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing. We're taking raw materials, transforming it into something different. Now, we might have other opinions on what we might think of as ultra processed foods, things like chicken nuggets, stuff like that. And that's kind of another issue. But processing essentially has made our food both safe and edible and available to a number of people. There are concerns with this, however, when we're talking about certain forms of processing. So, there's been a lot of debate about radiation or irradiating food, and that sounds scary, and maybe it is. Again, I am not a scientist, so I cannot necessarily speak to the hard science of this. Um, it's not like the food itself becomes radioactive, but they're trying to irradiate food to solve health problems. um, and probably problems that should be solved in other points of the supply chain. But let's take a look at irradiated food and think about those plants for a minute, because unlike major nuclear facilities, irradiation plants are probably going to be fairly small and probably not very well protected. So opponents fear that plants will be particularly vulnerable to sabotage and possibly terrorist attack, and also have similar concerns about the safety and security of shipping those radioactive materials. So if food irradiation became commonplace, then you'd have a lot of irradiation plants, and they'd have to have their inventory of cesium-137 and cobalt-60 replenished pretty regularly. So one thing is that the Energy Department, they have a byproducts utilization program, so they try to develop commercial uses for radioactive waste products. Cesium is a waste product of weapons production and civilian nuclear power. It's been one of its express goals, finding a use for this since the 1980s. Um, They've even priced it so low that they try to drive Canadian cobalt out of the market. Some people think that the Energy Department has been even more devious. They claim that the department wasn't so interested in disposing of the cesium rather than overturning the ban on reprocessing civilian nuclear fuel. So they claim that the department calculated that the widespread food irradiation would eventually deplete all of the available supplies of cesium. At that point, radiation industry would begin to lobby for the reprocessing of spent fuel, and the department could use that as political capital to reopen nuclear plants. I don't know about the truth of that, but it's certainly something to think about. One of the problems that radiation is meant to address would be things like fecal matter on, say, chickens or beef as it moves through the processing line. So as things have been increasingly sped up in the processing plants of meats, um, we find poop on the chickens, and the irradiation can take away the harmful effects or the harmful bacteria. Now, that leaves aside the question of whether there should be poop on the chicken in the first place, which I think is the bigger issue. So it's kind of a high-tech solution to something that probably should be solved in another portion of the processing. I think consumers would rather have no poop on their chicken at all rather than poop that's been irradiated so it's safe to eat. Another concern about processing is aggregation or kind of large scale processing, which means things are collected from a lot of different places and all put into one single batch. So we've seen the rise of contaminated products, particularly meats, ground meats, where you might have cattle coming from 6 or 7 different states, 15 or 20 or 50 different feedlots, and the meat is all ground and all combined together and then shipped out to multiple states, to where, if there's one carcass with a problem, it infects the entire batch of ground beef, let's say, and then it goes to restaurants, retail stores, consumers all over the country. So we've seen definitely an increase in those kinds of outbreaks. The same thing, however, can happen with produce. So, we've had recalls on bagged spinach, let's say. So that spinach is washed multiple times, packed together, but again, if part of that is contaminated and we're washing a huge batch of that at once, we might just be distributing the bacteria all over the place. So question becomes, is small and local better? So, there are a couple of ways to look at that. One is that any potential outbreak is going to be confined to a local area. So if a local farm, let's say, has some sort of problem with spinach and E. coli, because of, let's say, inadequate sanitation facilities in the field, well, that spinach is unlikely to spread very far beyond Mendocino or Lake County, let's say. Doesn't make it any better in terms of a public health problem here in the county, but it is not a nationwide potential crisis. There's some thought that small operations are going to pay more attention to detail than large processors, and I think that's a false argument, or kind of an illusion. Being small is no guarantee that people are doing anything any better. We would like to think so, and it's possible there's some truth in there, but being small or being a mom and pop operation or a family farm doesn't guarantee that your practices are really any better than any large processing plant. In fact, the large processing plant might have better safeguards in place. The advantage to small producers, however, is that as consumers, we can generally go and see what they're doing. So, if I have questions about how a particular food is produced and I'm at the farmer's market talking with the farmer, more likely than not, I can go and visit her farm and see how she's running her operation, and I can feel confident about my own choice in doing that. Generally speaking, I'm not invited into larger processing plants, and I'm not able to kind of check out their operation in that way. So there's very little transparency, let's say, in that process. So for that reason, small and local might be better. I'm not sure that ultimately, from a public safety standpoint, it always is, but being able to know your source and check that out for yourself is definitely a benefit. Now, I'm not discussing in this portion whether small and local is better for our local economies or our local food system. I believe it is, but again, there are arguments for and against that as well.